Hey there, folks. Currently out of town for work, but I want to continue my series of Trump's awful presidency. I wanted to try and find a subject that maybe will be less than a 10-minute video because he's so awful. So today, let's talk a little bit about Trump's Afghanistan policy. Now, my impression and takeaway from Trump's Afghanistan policy, and this is my personal take and not necessarily like definitive fact, but I'm well past the point of being charitable and looking at Donald Trump's policies, is that he really designed his Afghanistan policy to screw over his successor, in particular Joe Biden, and try and make Biden look bad. And we'll talk about why in a Now, it's worth noting that Donald Trump has always tried to portray himself as a peacemaker, as a non imperialist, as a guy who doesn't involve war. However, as far as Afghanistan goes, he actually escalated the conflict as soon as he got into office. In 2017, Secretary of Defense Mattis under Trump confirmed that the White House has given him new authority to set Afghanistan troop levels, which under the Obama administration had a strict limit on how many American troops could be in Afghanistan. And the argument at the time was that this was really an option so that they could actually better train, advise, and assist the Afghan forces, and that there was not really a change in military strategy. But it amounted to a dramatic increase in the number of U.S. troops in the country, which was about 8,400 under Obama, and was going to be increased by 3,000 to 5,000 more troops under Trump. Now, by August of 2017, it was acknowledged that the U.S. now had 11,000 troops in Afghanistan, more than formerly disclosed. So already we have more troops there than had been officially acknowledged previously. And the additional 2,000 troops were there supposedly to help local forces conduct counterterrorism missions. This wasn't the end, though, because by mid-September of the same year, the defense secretary confirmed that there were going to be 3,000 more troops sent to Afghanistan. At this point, that means the total number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan would be more than 14,000. So a very significant increase in the troop levels over the Obama era. Personally, it's not clear to me exactly what the Trump administration was thinking with this increase. It seems, if I'm being, again, not charitable, which I have no reason to be charitable to Donald Trump anymore, is that he was really trying to win the war. He thought he could win the war and show up Obama again, who couldn't win the war, even though the war had been going on since about 2000 and had been started by the Republican George W. Bush, but it seemed like Trump was taking a genuine stab at trying to finish it, and I suspect he did that primarily just to make Obama look bad. But he failed at that. So in February of 2020, the year of the 2020 election, of course, the U.S. signed a peace deal with the Taliban, who they'd been at war with for ages, to withdraw American troops basically completely from Afghanistan. Now, note that this deal was supposed to be within 14 months, but that timeline means that the withdrawal would happen in the next presidential administration, which means that if Trump lost the election, the problem would be passed on to his successor, who turned out to be Joe Biden. If it happened under Donald Trump, well, in principle, he wouldn't care because that would be his second term anyway. If he's going to honor term limits, then he wouldn't care what happens in his second term anyway. Now, the shocking thing about this deal, other than the timeline, is that it involved a prisoner exchange, which would involve the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. And very strikingly, it would not involve the official Afghan government based in Kabul, the government that we are supposedly allies of. They were left out of the peace negotiation process. Nevertheless, the Afghan government played ball and released most of the prisoners, and there were a few hundred that were not released right away because they were considered the greatest risk, but eventually, as I understand it, pretty much all of the prisoners that the Afghan government held were released. Well, this became a problem because just to show how bad of a deal it is, it was widely reported that, contrary to the Taliban's promises, many of the Taliban fighters immediately returned to the battlefield to fight against the Afghan government. In fact, by September 3rd, 2020, um, it was reported that basically almost all of the Taliban prisoners that had been released had immediately gone back into fighting against the government. As reported by Foreign Policy, it was a majority of the fighters returning to the battlefield. Now, it is true that after the peace deal was signed, the Taliban generally refrained from attacking coalition forces, with some notable exceptions, and they instead focused their attention on attacking the Afghan forces. In spite of the peace deal, and so nothing was done in response to this really by the US. Now, if you're cynical like me, you start to suspect that part of the reason that this deal happened in the first place is that despite Donald Trump's efforts, deaths on the battlefield of US soldiers increased under Donald Trump or in the Afghan conflict. In 2016, when Obama was still in office, 13, the second column indicates the number of US forces, 13 were killed. By 2019, now there was starting to be an increase again, where we were up to 24. And those combat deaths basically stopped once the peace deal was signed. Of course, once the peace deal was signed, for the Taliban, it was just a matter of a waiting game. They just had to wait and not attack U.S. forces, and they knew that U.S. forces were going to go away anyway. Of course, even though there was an improvement in the deaths in Afghanistan, Trump couldn't resist lying about that as well. He claimed that no U.S. troops died in Afghanistan for basically his last 18 months in office, and that is basically not true. Now, once Biden was in office, the collapse of the Afghan government went much faster than anybody anticipated, largely in part of the fact that it was a terrible deal. But part of it was probably due to the fact that the deal that was made was absolutely terrible and included releasing a veteran resistance fighter by the U.S. Basically, the U.S. demanded they be freed from a Pakistani jail, and that fighter became the next leader of Afghanistan under the Taliban. Basically, the Trump administration negotiated the release of their leader, who was able to then fight effectively. That isn't to say that Biden's result was perfect. I mean, an internal report that came out suggested that both presidents had a role in how disastrous the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan went. The Biden's decision to pull out all troops by September was considered criticized, as was the agreement negotiated by Trump in the first place. Personally, I'm not sure what Biden could have done much differently at that point. He really had been locked into a no-win situation by Trump's original treaty. I mean, presumably Biden could have argued and said, well, I'm going to stay in Afghanistan and basically violate the terms of the treaty with the Taliban, but that almost certainly would have involved the Taliban upping and increasing attacks on U.S. soldiers again, which also would have been considered a failure. So the Trump administration really locked Biden into a very difficult, if not impossible, situation. As a side note, it's worth mentioning that a political appointee answerable to Donald Trump delayed the transition process for Biden. So, not sure that it had a huge impact, but Biden had even less time to kind of assess the situation, thanks to the fact that the Trump administration was blocking the transition process. Now, you may ask, why would Trump do this in the first place? And I think the answer comes from this year, that for the election, they get to blame Biden for the Afghanistan withdrawal and forget their own role in it. So, in my opinion, Trump set up Biden to fail and screwed over the Afghan people in the process.